Welcome back, folks. This is a shot that we'll be working on today. As you can see, we've got our rivet character here doing a full body jump. Now get ready for a challenge, folks, because this is probably going to be the hardest exercise in this particular course. So don't worry if you're struggling. You'll actually even see me struggle through this exercise. I changed my mind 1,000 times, and that's just what happens in animation. Now, I'm also going to be showing you a few cartoony tricks. So even though this isn't too far from reality, I've pushed it a little bit into the cartoony world. So let me just scrub through and I'll show you a couple of those tricks. So in our little anticipation here in our spring through, I'm actually bending his arm backwards here over one frame. That's called breaking the joint. So I'll show you how to do that. And then you probably can see that I've given this character a lot more hang time, and then I wanted him to shoot down really fast and have quite an exaggerated stretch frame. I was treating that just like the bouncing ball where the squash and the stretch. So that's another trick that I'm going to show you. Now, if you struggle with this exercise, I would strongly suggest that you do a pass and you turn the arms off. You'll see in one section of the video, I actually do that for a portion, but I encourage you to probably do that from the start. So work with the whole body without the arms first, and then come back at a later stage and do the arms. As I said, this one's going to be the hardest. So are you guys ready for a challenge? Great, let's get started. Alright, now just to save a little bit of time, I've gone ahead and I've linked in my character as well as my background scene. So that's linked in there, you can tell with the little L there. And just so I'm showing you something slightly different, I'm going to show you the background setting in our scenes over here. So this is obviously the camera that we're going to use, it's called camera, but we have this option here to be able to change the background set. So when I choose this one here, which is my linked in background, you'll see it pop up here. Now this is really handy because it's our background, but it's not selectable, so it's not going to get in my way and I'm not going to accidentally be selecting it. The only thing is, in this state, when it's linked in, I can't edit it. So there's a handy little add-on that makes this a little bit easier. I want to move the layers that this background is on, but I can't do that inside this file. I have to do it inside the original file. So the way we do that is by using the Edit Linked Library add-on. You can see I've got it activated here. If it's not activated for you, just jump over to your user preferences, type in library. This is a handy add-on by Jason Van Gumster, Bassam Kadali, and Pablo Vasquez. So just make sure you activate that one and you'll get this option inside object mode. So what I'm going to do is actually have to jump over to our scene just real quick. I'm going to select our object here, and then when I push this button, it's going to close this file and it's going to open up the original file that this is linked from. So I'm going to click that and you'll see this is my original file, which is really handy. I'm just going to move the layers that it's on. So I'm going to pop our background on that layer, and I might as well just jump over to that layer so you can see. And then our option here is changed to be return to the original file. So now when I hit this, it's going to save this file and jump back. And also need to jump back into our actual working scene. And there we go. So when we turn on this layer here, you can see that our background is in place. Okay, so I'm ready to continue setting up our scene. One thing that's different from the last time is I'm not doing a 16:9 render. I'm doing a 4:3, so that's 1200 pixels by 800. That's just so I've got more vertical space and less dead space on the sides here. And my camera, I've changed it from 35 to a 30mm lens, and that's just so I can get more in here. So let me just speed that up while I position my camera and then put our character on top of the pillar here. There we go. Okay, so now I've saved it and we are ready to start the planning. So now it's time to have a little bit of a look at our video reference that I've shot for my planning stage here. So I've just jumped off this little chair a couple of times, and the first few takes were quite natural, and then at the end here I was trying to think of, let me scrub to that bit. So at the end here I was trying to think more cartoony, so where I'm like jumping and springing up because I'm thinking about the weight coming to a rest. So that's the last two takes where I was trying to think a little bit more cartoony. It's a little bit hard to do in the real world because you're living in the physics that happened in the real world and you're trying to do some cartoony stuff. So you kind of have to do a little bit of imaginative transformation, like take it from my body and transfer it onto a cartoony type character. You'll notice I should have listened to my own advice, and because this is a full body shot, I should have made sure that when I jumped in the air that my whole entire body was going to be in the shot, because I have to kind of guess from where my arms are going. They disappear off screen, and then I have to kind of guess as to where they've gone off screen here. So if you are shooting your own reference, please listen to my advice and do it better than I did. Make sure that you have your whole entire body in the scene. All right, so what I'm going to do now is just go through the takes that I like. I kind of like the first take because it's the most natural one, but then at the end here, I'm going to put a little bit more of the bounce from the last takes in there. So that's kind of where I'm thinking. But my first step, I'm going to do it exactly like our earlier shot, is that I'm going to go over this with the grease pencil. I'm going to use a slightly thinner pen this time, just because I want to grab more detail, because this rivet character actually closely resembles my body a little bit more than the ball with legs. So I'll fast forward through that bit, but here goes. So in this scribble pass, I'm looking for our key poses, which is basically where our body parts change direction, or anything that is kind of a cool looking pose. And I'm also making little notations for myself. So the arrow from my head was the direction that he's looking, and the lines on his chest, you can see I've drawn there, that's to show which way the chest is pointing. So I'm going to move away from the reference later on, but this is just a rough pass to get the key poses in there, and then we'll make it a little bit more cartoony as we move on further down the road. Now, other people aren't meant to be looking at this. All this notation just needs to make sense to you. So don't worry about being clean and neat or whatever. In fact, this might not even be a suitable purpose for you. Like, you might not want to do this stage. It's up to you, but this really helps me digest what's actually happening. I think you get the idea of what I'm doing. So I'm just going to jump forward to the finished version of this particular pass. All right, and here's the scribbles that I ended up with. I basically just picked a few key poses that I saw from my video reference, just like I did last time. I'm also trying to resemble where the middle of the chest is pointing, which is going to help me out when I pose it on our character here. And I'm also thinking about how the arms and how everything is moving in between these keyframes. So I'm not actually going to draw this breakdown pose here in between from this position to this position. I'm going to do that in 3D. So I'm just thinking about the more prominent poses, because once I do get it into 3D, it's going to be slightly stylized. Like, for example, this pose here, this is our anticipation pose before the jump. I'm going to push these poses so they become more cartoony. But just when I'm scribbling over this, I'm just paying attention to where all the body parts are pointing, the direction, as well as the hips. Are they pointed up? Which leg is lower than the other? I can see my left leg here is lower than my right leg here. But they're the things that I'm looking for. And I'm also going to, I've made some notes. Here's my stretch frame. You can see I'm going to make this more cartoony as well. I'm going to stretch him up. And I'm probably just going to even him out, like he's a little bit off center here, which I kind of don't like this pose, but I'll fix that in 3D. So that's enough talk for the moment. Let's jump into the animation. All right, so I'm just about to set my first keyframe. I'll take these poses that I've scribbled here and transfer them across to the character. But before we even do that, it's a good idea to kind of think about what mode we're going to animate our character in. Now, by that, I mean which parts are going to be in IK and which parts are going to be in FK. Now, I've decided that because these arms aren't going to be touching anything and they're just going to be purely attached to the body, I'm going to use FK arms. So I'm going to make sure that I turn my IK off. And I'll remember I've also set these to be quaternion in our rig file. So just watch the last video if you didn't know how I went ahead and did that. So these arms are in quaternion and the legs, but I'm actually not going to use the FK legs. I'm going to use the IK version. So I'm just going to turn off our layers there. So this left arm will be in FK mode. So it is switched down. So the IK here is switched off. Same with this one. Turn that one off. And do I want it to be isolated? That means, I'll just show you what I mean. If I isolate this FK, you'll see that this one stays parented to the world. And that's what I think I'm going to do with these characters. It will make it easier so that if I tweak the chest, I don't have to tweak the arm along with it. Our neck, I'm not going to isolate our neck, but I'm going to isolate our head. And I think everything else is good to go. Now, just before I jump into fast forward, I need to talk about the forearms here. We're only going to be animating on one axis, that is the Z axis here, even though we have the 3 axes open. If you want to do any rotation of the actual arm, it's best to do it from the upper arm here. Otherwise, you're going to run into a lot of rotation issues. But the reason I have the 3 axes open is later on I'm going to show you a little bit of an animation trick where we might need these 3 channels up here to break the joint. But I'll explain that when I do it. All right, let's get to the fast forward of me setting up my first pose. So now we're animating at 4 times the speed. And the first thing I'm doing is just grabbing all the bones that I want to work with in this first pass, which is, actually I think it's all the ones I have visible. So I wasted a little bit of time there, but sometimes that happens. Then once I've set the key frame on the first frame, I've named that action and then switched back to my video reference. And then I'm good to go. So I have to change the orientation mode there because when I moved them, it was going in its individual origin. So I moved the hips left and the feet went to the right. It's talking their right, not screen right. Now I'm posing out this first pose. Sometimes it can take the longest, but then once you've got things kind of sorted out, it gets a little bit easier. Now I've hidden the arms there just to make it easier for me to see the torso. And I was actually thinking at the time that I might do the whole pass without arms, but then I turned them back on and I thought, oh, well, I'll show you guys how to do it with the arms turned on, but I would strongly suggest that if you guys are struggling, just turn the arms off and then do the whole first pass without the arms and then come back and do the arms at a later stage. You might find that a lot easier to work with. So there we go. I'm just still trying to pose out that first pose there, and I think I'm getting close. I want it to kind of look as close to that video reference, but without looking kind of weird. So now that I've got my first pose, I'm going to do that for every single one of the poses that I have in my video reference. So here I go again. I'm off doing the second pose now, working on the torso first. And I want the hips to move back. You'll see that that's what actually happens in the video reference, but I don't want those hips to feel like they're gyrating at all. So there's a little bit of a back and forth there. And that's the thing that I do the most when at this stage is just flipping backwards and forwards amongst the keyframes from one keyframe to the next, starting usually at the hips and then working outwards. So this is the pose where he's looking over. Still trying to get those hips right. But let me just jump a little bit forward in time, just a few poses ahead. So I'm still on the same pass now. I've actually hidden my background and I'm working on the jump pose. So to move everything together, I'm just grabbing the feet and the torso and then translating them all at the same time. So I'm not having too much of an issue working with them. Now, one thing that I do quite often is, you'll see me do it in a moment, is where I accidentally hit the H key instead of the G key and it hides the bones. There's a couple of ways to get the bones back. Sometimes you can hit the undo key or you can hit Alt H, or sometimes just push spacebar and then type reveal selected, and that will get those bones back. But now might be a good time to show you another common problem that I have when I'm not paying attention. So I've just jumped a little bit ahead now where I'm working on a pose where I'm just working on these feet here, and I'll flip forwards and backwards, and I actually think I should be posing it when it's on the ground, but he's still in the air, and all my poses are there. I've just got them in the wrong order, which I realize as soon as I drag this one down and then I flip and I go, oh, what's going on with the feet? Whoops-a-daisy, but all is not lost. What I'm going to do is just select all our bones here, jump over to the dope sheet or the action editor. Make sure I'm only showing the controls that I want selected, so hitting that arrow. And then I basically want to take those last 2 keyframes and swap them around. But I do that by duplicating one of them and then dragging the last keyframe to that first position, and then jumping back to where that last position should be, or the last pose should be, and then dragging it back. And then I just checking to make sure I've done it all correct, and I have, and then I delete that extra keyframe. So there you go, basically just swap those two positions. Alright, so now I've made it to the end of that particular pass. I've basically just translated all of these poses onto our character up here. I have been working in spline mode, like spline blocking. It's not really stepped or it's not really spline blocking at this stage because I've mainly just been working on these particular poses. So I haven't been worried about the interpolation just as yet. So I've just been jumping forwards and backwards and flipping and having a look at these poses and trying to match them. Now let's have a look at this before I make a few adjustments here. So I'm just going to render this out. So there we go, we've rendered that out. Now we can have a look at how truly bad it is. Alright, so you can see some spots is too fast, too slow. I've got some weird head bobbles going on there. That's all okay at this stage because it's going to get better over time. So what I'm going to do now that I have all those poses in there is retime them. I'm also going to shift the camera just so we're I can actually, I think I've got a little bit more room up the top here. So I'm not, rather than take him higher, I'm just going to move the camera down a little bit and then retime everything. So I'm going to go into fast forward mode while I do that. The first thing I do is make sure that I adjust our camera and make sure that he doesn't go off the bottom of the frame or out of the top of the frame. Now it's time to retime everything. So I'm just switching over to my dope sheet editor there, or my action editor, and using the dope sheet summary just to move all the keyframes, just with the E key to extend them. One thing I'm doing is I'm borrowing an interpolated frame that the computer gives me, and if I set a keyframe on that, then I can shift it in time, and then that way it'll extend a pose for a certain longer amount of time, like a moving hold. And just flipping forward, deciding if I'm doing the same thing there, adding an extra keyframe, and then just finishing it up now. Alright, so now that I've made those changes, let's have a quick look at what's going on. We're going to be watching this view over here. So you can see I'm still in spline mode. The timing is a lot better, but we've still got a fair bit of weird animation going on. But at this early stage in the animation, we're not going to worry because there's going to be a lot of changes that are going to happen. Now, I'd be almost ready to show this to someone, but there is a lot of confusing animation happening in this actual spline blocking. I'm just going to show you a little trick that you can do if you'd like to work in spline blocking, but you need to show it in step blocking. So what I'm going to do, just with all my curves selected, I'm going to select everything in here. I'm going to hit T, change it to be constant. Then I'm going to spit out a version where we've got the constant or the stepped blocking. And then once it's finished doing its pass, I can hit undo inside our curves editor here, and everything will go back to normal. But you see, if I play my animation here, I'll just bring it up, it's now in stepped mode. So I can save this out, and I haven't edited my curves at all. And now just scrubbing through this, you can see that in stepped mode, it is not as confusing as it was. But now it's time for me to do a little bit more work on this to get it looking good. So I need to make sure that our poses on these keyframes are actually looking decent. And also down here, we've got a few animation problems where it's just a little bit stiff. So I'm going to do a little bit more work here to try and sell that weight bounce and those arms flopping around. So I've just jumped into fast forward while I do those final little changes here. And I do actually turn on my motion paths to get a better understanding of how it's going to work, but I'm not totally focused on the final result yet. I just want to get a rough idea of that arc and make sure he's not doing anything crazy in 3D space. I think later on I shift him back a little bit. So making sure that this foot is pointed in the line of action. And I also want to push these arms up a little bit and make sure they're not penetrating the shoulder there. It's a little bit of a weird character design, so his arms aren't as flexible as you kind of see. Breaking up the animation on his feet, so they're not moving at the same rate as his torso there. And now what I'm going to do is I want to move all these poses back. So I'm just going to grab our Y location on our hips there, move it back, then grab both of our feet and hide all the other curves and grab our Y location and move them back under the body. So I've just moved all those final keyframes together, and you're just doing the final adjustments. So that way I could just slide the curves rather than move all of the actual keyframes. It was a lot easier for me to do that. Alright, so I'm just going to jump forward to the end of this particular pass now. So there we go, we have our first pass of our blocking here. This is rendered out in stepped blocking, even though I can just easily switch back our curves to the spline mode here. So I'm going to call this one done for my blocking. This is at the stage where I would show someone and say, am I on the right track? And then they would make some notes and I'll continue from there. So let's move on to the splining stage.